So moving on to while loops. So a while loop is also a similar type of operator to a for loop where it helps you run a certain operation multiple times. However, its application is fundamentally different. So if you recall, if you're going back to a for loop starts with the expression for. You have your counter, and then you have your body of operations or commands which you want to run, and then an end line. A for loop is fundamentally different in its composition. So when running a for loop and you want to run a certain operation 10 times, so let's say I want to run the same operation here where I'm calculating I to the power 2 and then putting them all in an array. So in this case, for a while loop, the first line should always be initializing your counter. So in this case, I'm going to say I equals 0, and this is the initialize line, right? It's the line where I initialize the counter, and then I can introduce the while command. So while I is less than or equal to 10, so now I is 0, and while I is, as long as I is less than 10, you can run these commands. So in this case, I'll say k is equal to I to the power 2. So again, I'm calculating a new variable k, which is equal to I squared. And now in a while loop as well, so let's write some comments. So this is the while command, and again, just be careful that for the while and for loops, the W and F at the start of the command have to be small. If you use a capital F or a capital W, you're gonna get an error. So this is the while command. This is the body of the loop again. And unlike the for loop where you can just end it directly, here you need to create a counter. So I need to tell MATLAB how to change I. So in this case, I'm going to say I is equal to I plus 1. And then I'm going to have the end line. So this is actually the counter line in this case. So as MATLAB executes this loop, every time I will increment by 1 until it eventually reaches to 11, and then it's going to terminate the loop. So if I run the script, you can see here that it's going to calculate k. So k will be calculated from when I is 1, k is 1, I is 2, k is 4. So again, k is I squared, all the way when I is 10, k is 10. And then when I becomes 11, it's going to exit the loop because this expression is no longer valid. Okay, so again, when running a while loop, you need to have two lines which are different than a for loop. First one is the initialize line, so you must always initialize your counter, and this has to be outside the loop. And then the second line is inside the loop before your end command, and it has to be your counter increment line. So you need to tell MATLAB how do you want this counter to change. So you could say, if you don't want to increase it by 1, you could increase it by 2, you could increase it by 5, doesn't matter, but you need to give MATLAB a method for this counter to change and increase so that it has a way out of this loop. If you don't include the counter increment line, this loop is going to run infinitely and there is no end to this loop basically, right? And again, in a while loop, similar to a for loop, a very common manipulation is creating an array. So let's do the same thing. I'm going to create an array, call it I squared, and then I'm going to call the element position using the counter, in this case I. So logically, it makes more sense to put this line before the counter increment, right? So I'm going to say I underscore squared I, which is the position, is equal to k. And here I'm trying to save all of these values of I into an array. So if I run this, okay, so when we ran it here, we got an error. And the logical error here is that the first value for I in this case is 0. So when it went through the loop, so I is 0 here, 0 less than 10, okay, k is equal to I squared, so k is 0 squared, so k is 0. And then I'm looking for the element at position 0. And there is no element at position 0 because the element position starts from 1. So in this case, I have two ways to change it. I could either let I equals 1. So if I let I equals 1, it solves this problem because then I is 1, 1 is less than 10, k is 1 squared, then I underscore squared of 1 is equal to k. So in this case, I'm filling up this array starting from position 1, and then I'm incrementing the loop. And I'm sure you can see that there are many different ways to logically structure this to meet your end. So as long as you have your initialize line, your counter increment line, and the while and end lines, you could logically do whatever you want to do the calculation you desire. So in this case, if I say I equals 1 and I run I squared, you can see now I squared is an array with 10 elements going from 1 to 100, and I put all my results in one array. So this is the for loop. This is the while loop, sorry. A for loop is usually easier to use and more commonly used because logically it's more straightforward. However, there are some conditions in which a while loop is more valid, especially when you have uncertainties. While loop becomes more valid to use than a for loop. So less than, greater than, that's when the while loop comes into the picture.